Sorry, I think we are running short of time, so without wasting much time, let us come on to the abstract number 1. The conclusions of this abstract shows the main reason for favorable trends in the mortality has been the use of oral contraceptive pills, particularly in the US and the EU, and and decline in hormone replacement therapy. Postmenopausal hormone therapy may also have played a role in terms of reducing the mortality associated with ovarian cancers. So I just want to ask the panelists, how would you interpret the observations? How can we sort of analyze the declining trends in ovarian cancer in certain sections, and where do we see ourselves heading towards? Anybody?
See, the trends in mortality worldwide may not be what we should expect, because as you can see, they've said oral contraceptive pills, less use of hormones are possibly one of the reasons that they've brought out. But there's another facet to it. One of the important protective factors against CA ovary is parity. So now in India, definitely the use of oral contraceptives have gone up, and hormone replacement therapy, it is as everyone's guess. But what I feel is we should brace for an increase in the incidence of ovarian cancer, because over the years the parity has definitely come down. So the protective effect of parity has gone. The effect of oral contraceptive pills, the use has gone up. So that is going to take some more time. So till it stabilizes, I think we should brace for an increase in the incidence of ovarian cancer, maybe for a few years from now. That's my take on it.
Sorry.
Well, I'm sure oral contraceptive pills and less use of hormones does have a role to play. But let us not take away the credit from the gynae oncologists also. I think the treatment has also improved quite significantly over the years. One must remember that the mortality reduction was mainly seen in the younger age group. And this is the age group where we are more likely to have, more ultrasounds, and because of the higher rate of infertility now, higher PCODs. So most of the times the detection is earlier in this age group. And secondly, these patients are more likely to withstand the kind of aggressive surgery and chemotherapy that's done now. So you can do, and we know that this surgery has certainly added to the survival and has brought down the mortality. So probably over the years, that's one of the causes.
Yeah, and I think the other thing probably because they haven't specified that this is exclusive to carcinoma, so the younger patient more likely to have germ cell tumors. So that may have also contributed to the. So I think if you see the trends in all the countries, Sanket, you wanted to add something? Anil, yeah.
No, other thing was just looking at the list of countries. I think none of these countries are actually so-called developing world. If you see in these countries, the incidences of cancers are exactly opposite, the rise and the fall both. For example, breast cancer is rising everywhere, but more so in the developing countries. So in ovarian cancer, we should have included at least a couple of these countries, either in Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, to really know what happens to ovarian cancer there. Yeah, so that will tell a better story.
And the other thing that you observed in these trends is that there was a steady increase in the cancer mortality from 70 to 90, and from 90 onwards the mortality actually started going down. So should we attribute to aggressive surgery, or should we attribute to more chemotherapeutic agents entering the field?
Possibly a combination of both.
Yeah.
One more thing that has been brought out in the study is the mortality rates have gone down in those countries where the incidences were higher. So incidences, the countries with low incidences or stable incidences, actually the mortality has slightly gone up, or it has stayed the same. So the change is most evident in those countries where the incidence of CA ovary has been very high.
Yeah, and unfortunately, obviously, we don't have any sort of Indian data. But I just want to add, is there something that we see in near future that can actually, any therapeutic intervention, be it medical, be it surgical, that will actually influence reducing the ovarian cancer mortality further?
Maybe the tubal surgery in addition while we are doing the hysterectomies?
So I think what probably that will reduce the incidence. What we are essentially looking at a
Mortality.
patient who has already been diagnosed, with ovarian cancer. What that will bring down in terms of reducing the mortality
I think-
associated.
Profiling.
So I think the most important shift of trend is more complete cytoreductions, doing more upper abdominal surgeries for extensive ovarian cancers. I think that is probably going to make the biggest change.
And I think one more factor which is important is now there is more and more role for, for what shall I say, risk reduction surgeries in patients who are BRCA2 positive. It will bring, and we know that nearly about, I think 8 or 10% of these patients actually do have cancer when they're operated. And probably this kind of surgery will probably bring down
Yeah.
the mortality further.
Ashish, you see anything, from the medical oncology perspective, that can influence the outcomes in ovarian cancers?
I mean, overall, my take on this is that the improvements that are seen is a culmination of multiple factors playing there. In terms of improving further mortalities, I feel, as Sanket said, more intensive surgeries, developments in the chemotherapy field, and I also agree with Dr. Tongaonkar sir said, that identifying people who are with BRCA positivity and giving them drugs also which are coming like olaparib, which will further help us in improving the outcomes.
Okay, so that's it. So let us move on. Yeah, sorry, anybody? Yeah. You wanted to add something?
I just wanted to add, probably in our country, just the facility being available would improve, because in our country, I suppose 50% of the patients must not be getting any facility. So getting more facility would improve in our country.
Okay, so more infrastructure.
Getting more patients operated by gynae-oncology.
Correct, yeah.
But actually, that will be a major contributing factor even in this study, because worldwide that trend has changed, that more and more gynecologic oncologists are operating on ovarian cancer.
Yeah.
So that itself might have contributed a lot.
Okay, so let us move on to the abstract second and third, because they are more or less similar. One was the meta-analysis of the randomized trial for neoadjuvant chemo, and second was the ASCO practice guidelines. Okay, the only thing, before we actually interpret the results, just to highlight the subset of patients that were included in the URTC trial, almost 60% of the patients had an extrapelvic disease which was more than 5 centimeters, and almost 40% had a disease which was more than 10 centimeters. So I think, majority of the time the results of this trial have been misinterpreted, that any patient, even a small upper abdominal disease, is not the right candidate for neoadjuvant chemotherapy. So that is one thing. I think as this trial was criticized, the overall survival, even the primary debulking group was significantly lower than the historical controls. Obviously, we can't, compare the two, but it was considerably lower, and in patients whom they actually achieved an R0 resection, the overall survival sort of matched with the historical control. So that was another thing. And the rate of optimal surgery, which was defined as less than 1 centimeter residual disease, was about 40%. And again, the results of CHORUS trial were also similar. The only objective or sort of difficult thing to understand was a very high mortality rate that was described in the CHORUS trial, which was about 5.6%. And this, I think Samar has described the median OS and PFS in the meta-analysis and the recommendations for both. Now, the only thing, we know, you have a patient, what criteria, we should have take-home message as to what are the criteria that, okay, these are the cases where we should be doing a primary surgery. I can ask you individually, if you wish to, as to on what grounds you decide, okay, this patient is going to go for NACT and this patient is going to go for surgery. If anybody, or you can start.
So basically, if extensive disease is there, which is upper abdomen extensive disease is there, lot of stage 4 disease means PWF is there. In those patients, always NACT is better. But if I can think, I can do R0 resection less than 1 centimeter, maybe not less than 1 centimeter, completely R0, it is better to operate upfront.
So should all our decisions be based on CT scan itself, or do you think, Sanket, that adding on laparoscopy, in doubtful cases will actually add on value in terms of deciding whether the patient
now
should?
the same group that is doing the Scorpion trial, Fagoty, they have actually validated a score which is called as the Fagoty score for laparoscopic evaluation of completeness of cytoreduction, possibility of completeness of cytoreduction. They've used criteria like peritoneal carcinomatosis, diaphragmatic carcinomatosis, involvement of the small intestine or the stomach, retraction of the root of the mesentery, and liver metastasis. Based on the 6 criteria, each is given a score of 0 or 2, positive or negative, and if you find that the score is 8 or more, there is a 100% incidence of incomplete cytoreduction. And this has been externally validated in another study as well. So, which means that we do have a tool which is very, very strongly predictive of whether we'll achieve a complete cytoreduction or not, and we routinely use that in doubtful cases.
Yeah. So I think laparoscopy can be used. Sir, you want, yeah.
I think laparoscopy can certainly be used, but as you very rightly said, in selected cases. You don't need it in all cases. Most of the times you can make out on a good CT and a clinical examination that you're likely to achieve an optimal cytoreduction or a complete cytoreduction. I think what is more important in our country is not the disease factor, but the patient factor. A lot of our patients are malnourished, they have very low proteins, serum albumin, and they're nutritionally poor. So, if you want to do any kind of an extensive surgery, you may land up doing a fantastic surgery, but if the patient is not going to survive or going to land up in the ICU for 15 days and delay her chemotherapy by 2 months, it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I
So
was actually...
basically it has to be a good selection of patients. So first, most important are patient factors, and then the tumor factors. If the patient is fit to do for any kind of major surgery, then you decide whether you are likely to have an optimal or complete cytoreduction. In my opinion, personal opinion, apart from parenchymal liver metastasis, mesenteric involvement, most of the patients otherwise can have good primary surgery.
Yeah. Dr. Sabita, you wanted to add something on
It is,
that?
of course, the serosal.
And serosal multiple
serosa
nodules.
is involved throughout, then of course.
But I don't know. I think the bowel serosal involvement, which happens just like a plaque, I don't think, the conventional imaging would be able to pick it up. I think most of the times you will have to use laparoscopy. Yeah, you.
I think that patient factors is very, very important, true. But at the same time, one has to keep in mind that a lot of patients don't necessarily improve with the chemotherapy. Some of them, in fact, become even worse after the chemotherapy. Even their responses in the post-chemotherapy phase, when you do an extensive surgery based on their original CT scan report, often their responses are completely different. A lot of them will have persistent tachycardia, a lot of cardiac issues are there. A lot of them will end up requiring supports, inotropic supports. So it is not just a question of giving chemotherapy. So yes, patient factors are very important. So patients with high morbidity, aged patients, one will surely send for chemotherapy irrespective. You don't want to land up with a surgical issue. But otherwise, one should think very hard about just sending blindly for chemotherapy.
Yeah.
One more factor, if you allow me, about
Yeah.
the Chorus trial. If you look at the mean operative time there, it is 2 hours.
Yeah.
Now, can anyone tell me what kind of a surgery for ovarian cancer you can do in 2 hours? It's surprising that 26% of patients did not have a hysterectomy, 24% did not have one or both ovarian masses removed, 40% didn't have any lymphadenectomy. Now, this is no surgery for ovarian cancer.
Even the other trial, only 20% have landed up with optimal cytoreduction.
Yeah.
Far lower than any other setting.
Yeah, but I think in defense of that, what they were saying is that the subset of patients that we actually selected to be part of the trials had a very advanced disease, because you can't compare all 3C with a subset of patients who had more than 10 centimeter of extrapelvic disease. So that was the major criteria. So sorry.
Here is the question whether the imaging only modality is the deciding factor, or the patient, like clinical examination or other part also taken, like only CT and MRI is a deciding factor to do a operability, or even now PET scan should necessary to decide the operability.
See, I don't think the abstract which was what we were discussing. Actually, they have recommended a CT scan, abdomen, pelvis, oral, and intravenous contrast is good enough to decide. And the only thing that they have found in certain studies that PET scan is slightly better to pick up the upper abdominal disease, particularly along the diaphragm, because sometimes you may miss it on a conventional CT scan. The thing is, whether you do PET scan or CT scan, I don't think the imaging modality will add on dramatically, something more than what we have, and where laparoscopy will actually be of more help than doing a PET CT.
Actually, in the paper, they have also said that although PET scan picks up more disease, it does not modify the surgical plan.
Right.
So it's not going to change the management in any big way.
And so I think when we are deciding about, the treatment modality, as we said, one is the operability, and second thing is the patient factors, whether the patient will be able to withstand the surgery. And I think this was the score which was developed by Aletia, and I think it's a good guide in terms of identifying the patients who are likely to have a stormy post-operative course, and then you can decide accordingly, whether you want to go ahead with primary surgery or a neoadjuvant chemotherapy. And this 30-day morbidity, the predictors were surgical complexity, the patient's albumin less than 3.5, and ASA grade 3 or 4. So I think these are three factors. So combining these two, we can take a call which way we really want to go. Now the other thing that highlighted was confirmation of diagnosis before neoadjuvant chemo. And do you really believe that in every patient we should be doing a core biopsy prior to giving chemo, or a cytology, ascitic fluid cytology is good enough?
Biopsy can be done, should be done.
Kedar, yeah.
Obviously, histopathologists will prefer core biopsy. Obviously, if it's a high-stage disease, one receives a core biopsy, and we can definitely say first step is to confirm there's a high-grade adenocarcinoma, and secondly, then to type it as a high-grade serous adenocarcinoma by immunohistochemistry, which is WT1 and PAXID. These are the standard markers, Mullerian markers. Another modality that we can actually do is that of the cell block preparation of ascitic fluid. I think Bharat mentioned in the morning case presentation, in that we have ascitic fluid for cytologic examination, and we prepare a cell block preparation with a small modification in technique and process it as we process as a biopsy. And even that allows immunohistochemistry performance on the malignant cells. Obviously, we need to have a good cell yield, malignant cell yield in that, and that can also give us. So if there's a small chance that this could be a GI cancer, we want to exclude GI cancer, that allows the cell block preparation to again perform the immunohistochemistry relevant ones for Mullerian tract, and which can support serous carcinoma diagnosis.
Anybody wants to add something? So I think, if possible, a core biopsy will always be better, than you won't ending up with surprises at the end of the treatment, even if there is a rare possibility. The other thing was, I think it's chemotherapy protocol. Ashish just wanted to ask, do you agree with 3 courses, or you feel, 3 or 4 should be is okay?
I think most often we stick to 3 cycles and then take them up for surgery.
Okay. And any deviation from protocols, or just a standard paclitaxel and carboplatin? So I think this is it. So, and the other thing that the paper highlighted, and the other aspect that I wanted to discuss, what will be the best thing for a patient who has a malignant pleural effusion? Okay, patient who has a malignant pleural effusion, but apparently operable intra-abdominal disease. Okay, so what should be the way forward in these patients? Because as per the recommendation, I think they would do better with neoadjuvant chemotherapy, but does anybody have?
I mean, the patient has just a pleural effusion as stage 4 disease. I would rather put an ICD, do a primary surgery, and then put the patient on chemotherapy if the patient is otherwise in a good general condition, good performance status.
So is anybody, Sanket, or anybody has a and the other thing that I want, you wanted to add something? Yeah.
I usually prefer chemotherapy because majority of the centers across the world would go for chemotherapy.
So the possible reason is with a ICD in situ or with a pleural effusion, the anesthetic complications tend to be higher. So the morbidity definitely goes up. Surgery definitely, as Sir said, is possible. So post anesthetic, I think surgery becomes easier. That is one of the main advantages. I don't think it is not dependent on the operability per se.
If you look at some of the guidelines and look at the pleural effusion, the only stage 4 factors where you can say primary surgery is probably better is with pleural effusion, supraclavicular node, and inguinal nodes. So these are within stage 4. These are small subset of patients where probably you can do surgery.
Okay, and the other thing that I wanted to ask the panelist is, what is the role of lymph node dissection in a patient who has received neoadjuvant chemo? I mean, in primary surgery, if you have achieved R0 resection, we do. Are we going to do a systematic pelvic and para-aortic lymph node dissection if you have achieved an R0 resection after a neoadjuvant chemotherapy?
I mean, the surgery, after chemotherapy, and you want to go in for
you have given chemotherapy, neoadjuvant chemo, you've done the surgery. So the intra-abdominally you have achieved an R0 resection. Normally, if you are doing primary surgery, we would be adding lymph node dissection to our surgery. Once you have achieved complete intraperitoneal clearance, would you go ahead with the same?
I would go ahead with a complete lymphadenectomy because I feel that still a lot of lymph nodes do remain even after chemotherapy. And
I think it is recommended.
Some of the studies they say that the nodes which are bigger earlier on should be removed.
That's why I said it is recommended to be done if the initial imaging suggests nodal disease.
I think, if you're looking at achieving a complete cytoreduction, unless you remove that tissue, you'll not know. There's a very good Japanese article where they've shown that there are a lot of even cancer stem cells which remain in the fibrotic tissue that remains after chemotherapy in the retroperitoneum. So only when you do a complete lymphadenectomy that you'll be able to remove all these cells. And you'll be surprised the number, because the tissue is very flat post-chemotherapy. And you'll miss a lot of nodes if you don't remove that tissue.
Just one thing, this last December, there was a Washington annual conference on peritoneal surface malignancy, and we presented our data about the incidence of lymph nodal metastasis in ovarian cancer. And the incidence was identical whether it was primary or post-NSCT or recurrence. It's almost 60%. Also, when a particular viscera is involved, where there is actually serosal infiltration of any viscera, when you do an anatomical resection of that viscera, you will find that almost in 40% of those patients, you will have lymph nodes draining that viscera to be positive as well, like the small intestine or the right colon or anti-resection. So lymph node dissection should be an integral part, because otherwise we are just leaving behind disease.
Okay, so let us move on to the next abstract. Yeah.
We had given 3 neoadjuvant chemotherapy, a standard paclitaxel and carbo, and there was still no response. Whether to change the chemotherapy or still go ahead with some surgical.
I'll answer. In that publication, they said that they have so poor prognosis that best is to keep them on supportive care. If the patient, in the study has said that. Now, of course, that is an individual decision, but in the study they were put on supportive care only.
Sorry, yeah.
Just wanted to ask the respected panelists that what do we do now? The new thing is coming up about the visualization of the pleura through laparoscopy before doing the primary debulking surgery. So, what is the role and any guidance on that?
At least I don't. Is anybody doing it? Sanket or Anil? Anybody wants to add? I don't.
This
think
particular paper, the recommendations, what they say is evaluation is basically by either an X-ray chest, preferably by a CT of the chest. There's no recommendation as far as doing a thoracoscopy to visualize.
Evaluate the pleura. Okay. So let us move on. I think we are running short of time. Is the next abstract the role of tumor infiltrating lymphocytes and PD-L1 expression in ovarian cancer, particularly in patients who have received neoadjuvant chemotherapy. So just Kedar, if we tomorrow we have to understand, will we be able to assess the percentage of TIL in ovarian cancer, and does it have an impact in terms of prognostication?
We will be able to assess, that I can say. Whether it has a prognostic implication, I do not know. Traditionally, we've seen that there are very few malignant tumors which actually can spontaneously regress, and one is a malignant melanoma. And when pathologists looked at those slides, we found that it has a lot of lymphocytic infiltration. So that's how we came to understand that the tumor infiltrating lymphocytes or chronic inflammatory response in a malignant tumor plays a role in the biological behavior. Then we came to the right-sided colonic tumors. They are poorly differentiated tumors, HNPCC-related tumors, but which have more tumor infiltrating lymphocytes. They show better prognosis. So that's the role. And currently, the hot topic is in lung cancers, where we have tumor infiltrating lymphocytes and detection of PD-1 and PD-L1 by immunohistochemistry, and that has a specific targeted therapy on that. So that has a proven role. It requires PD-L1 immunohistochemistry antibody. Dr. Menon actually said there's a little bit of challenge or difficulty in actually assessing what is positive, how much is to call positive. So that is a technical matter that we can do it. It also requires CD4, CD8, and CD168 as markers by immunohistochemistry. That also is possible. These markers can also be detected in lymphocytes as well as macrophages. So that is also possible. Whether we have any particular meaningful cutoff which can predict, okay, this will give predictive, that I think we need studies on that. So that is, and other thing is post-chemotherapy, we see a lot of foamy macrophage aggregation in the stroma. And whether those are positive and those also will play a role in predicting the biological behavior, I think it remains to be seen. But this certainly opens up new diagnostic and predictive, or sorry, therapeutic options for us, definitely. So technically, definitely possible. I do not know what would be the clinical significance or cutoff at this juncture.
Yeah. Dr. Preeta, you would want to add to this and the role of, say, evolving role of immunotherapy in ovarian cancers?
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to be probably a next generation practice for us. Particularly, we don't have any effective second-line therapy for this metastatic disease. But again, the question will come: whom to? Is it given? It should be given in general, or we have to select a group of patients, because this PD-1 and PD-L1 expression is also transient, and they also showed that after the NSCT it's increasing. And other checkpoints, immune checkpoints, inhibitors might be coming to play in big role for this kind of disease.
So as of today, do we have any evidence, any sort of positive evidence in terms of where you can use this pathway as for intervention in recurrent ovarian cancers?
Yeah, there are a couple of trials, clinical trials are going with the PD-L1 in the relapse setting, in platinum resistant, whereas platinum sensitive disease, and there are encouraging results are coming up. But again, I think the patient selection is very important for giving this kind of therapy.
So you will be using the TIL as the criteria for patient selection as to who will benefit from immunotherapy?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So I think that is one thing probably that may impact in future, that the tumor infiltrating lymphocytes may open a second avenue in patients who have a recurrent ovarian cancer and not much options with the rest of the chemo. Coming to the abstract 5 and 6, they were about molecular characterization and comparison of epithelial ovarian cancers and primary peritoneal cancer. And second thing was a comparative analysis of clinico-pathological features, molecular subtypes, and treatment outcomes. I think, the abstract has been discussed, but what we found, majority of the patients in primary peritoneal cancer eventually end up getting upfront chemotherapy. Almost 70% of them received chemotherapy, and even though you achieve an optimal cytoreduction in a primary peritoneal cancer after chemo, their survival still remains much poorer than the ovarian counterpart. So the question is, should we identify primary peritoneal cancer as an entity? Because normally we talk about tube, fallopian tube, ovary, and peritoneal cancer in the same breath. But in terms of the age at which they present, in terms of their overall prognosis, I think they are inferior to ovarian cancer. So should we treat primary peritoneal cancer as a separate entity, than ovarian cancer? And the other problem that you have is, how do you label a patient as a primary peritoneal? Now, most of the criteria that have been established are histopathological. Okay, so you have a patient who has an ascites who does not have an ovarian mass. Now, how do we decide whether it's a primary peritoneal cancer or whether it's a primary ovarian cancer?
I think a primary peritoneal cancer is a diagnosis by exclusion. That you have cytology that is positive, ascitic fluid cytology, there are no ovarian masses that you can see. You need to rule out GI cancers, stomach, breast, pancreatic, gallbladder cancers. And only when you rule all these out and the pathologist tells you that yes, is likely to be serious or something, that is the time you call it a primary peritoneal. That's at least what I follow.
Some of them have small fallopian tube cancers.
Yes. Yeah, but that...
Usually by the pathologist and gets labeled as a primary peritoneal.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the thing is, if we consider that both ovary and peritoneum are essentially coming from the fallopian tube, then the behavioral pattern of both the cancers is not exactly the same, nor their pathways that they are, the molecular profiling does not suggest that they are similar in terms of their behavior. So the other thing is, should there be a change in approach when, say, suppose you identify a patient with primary peritoneal cancer on clinical examination and radiological evaluation, should the approach be more aggressive surgery for primary peritoneal cancers rather than going ahead with a neoadjuvant chemo?
See, unfortunately, primary peritoneal cancer is not a very common cancer, which is why, although there is a lot of interest about intraperitoneal chemotherapy or heated intraperitoneal chemotherapy, we'll probably never see like a randomized trial comparing the outcomes of the two. But just by the historical data that has been there, it does appear to be logical to use some form of intraperitoneal chemotherapy after a PPC because it tends to fail at a much faster rate within the peritoneal cavity itself.
One more reason I feel that possibly aggressive surgery may not be possible is because these are the patients who develop cancer at a much advanced stage. So primary peritoneal cancer is shown to, the age group is higher compared to epithelial ovarian cancer. And second thing, the thing that you mentioned, possibly the origin is in the fallopian tube. It something related to the tumor biology. And the answer could possibly be in the molecular profiling. It is what this paper says is possible. It is the C1 type of tumors which develop as primary peritoneal cancers because for some reason the tumor is not supposed not able to grow in the ovary. So that is why it spreads in the peritoneum and so the mesenchymal type.
Yeah. So then, that just wanted to ask Dr. Preeta then or Kedar, can you actually identify those subtypes as from C1 to C6, what has been described in the paper? That may just help us decide, whether the patient would undergo an optimum surgery or not.
Histologically, we are still currently following the standard high-grade serous carcinoma diagnosis. In amongst that, we have C1, C2, and 2, C5. I think C3, C4 are some of the low-grade serous carcinoma and well-differentiated endometrioid cancers. We exclude that. C1 are supposed to be mesenchymal type or epithelial mesenchymal transition, which shows a lot of desmoplastic reaction. And C2 are the ones which have tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes, which may have a therapeutic role in PD-L1 antibody positivity. Now, to be honest, if I have a biopsy, it may not be possible for me to actually give you subtyping of high-grade serous carcinoma on C1 or C2. Although it is, if I'm careful, if I have more tissue, it may be possible. It probably, I think it's, as I see it currently, is realistically may not be possible. If you tell me it has a therapeutic role, then I'll have to try harder with some other ancillary technique, whether I can have a better anything else or no. But currently, I think high-grade serous adenocarcinoma, sometimes you struggle so much on a small biopsy, whether first of all to establish cancer cells is one. Secondly, to exclude a GI primary with reasonable surety on histology is the second point. And third is to say high-grade serous carcinoma. So beyond which it may be difficult on a given biopsy. But although we know that there are different types and which may have a therapeutic role in particular types. Dr. Preeta, you may wish to add something.
Yeah, I totally agree with Dr. Kedar that it's really difficult to, although this classification has been promoted by TCGA data analysis C1, C2, and probably they have started showing that they respond differently, but it's really difficult to identify these subtypes from very small tissue section. And they primarily did it by NGS, which is again a very costly affair.
So
it's
it won't
not
be
really realistically
possible. So I think as of now, then we just go by what, yeah?
What kind of tissue volume would you require, if I may ask?
Volume-wise, even people are trying from the FFPE blocks also, it's possible, but it all depends that how good quality of DNA you are getting. Yeah, more tissue is better. But again, it depends on how good quality of DNA you are getting, because there are a lot of T cells, there are a lot of other factors that can affect the DNA quality, and that can actually affect the whole sequencing.
So I think as of today, the molecular types that have been described are essentially, we can't transform that information into clinical decision making. That's what we should look at. Now coming to the last abstract, we have about 5 minutes left. Is the chromosomal instability in cell-free DNA as a highly specific biomarkers for detection of ovarian cancers? in women with adnexal masses. Now, I think it's the sensitivity that quoted has been roughly around 88-89%, and the specificity is about 90-94%. Now, the thing is, with already having so many things, which are at your disposal in terms of identifying whether the mass is likely to be benign or malignant. I can understand you can use this as a marker for relapse, or if you can detect the relapses early, but for characterization of a mass, whether it's benign or malignant, do we really think this can have a clinical impact, or will it come in time? Because you have MRI and even a 3D ultrasound with very high sensitivity and specificity in terms of identifying whether the mass is benign or malignant. Ashish, you can have.
I think the technique is extremely interesting, and with a combination of these factors plus that test identifying that it could be a potential malignant mass, it may be helpful in future. But I think it requires a lot of verification because the data is too early and in a very small number of patients, so it's very difficult to conclude at this point of time.
Dr. Preeta, you want to add?
Relapse setting, I'm not sure you really want to do this kind of testing, because even CA-125 relapses, you are now treating them. So why you want to pick up relapses even earlier than that?
No, I think it's basically, when you have a newer modality, if it comes, with current settings, it may not be of great help, because we are anyways not treating unless there is radiological evidence. We anyways don't treat.
Right. So in fact, there may not be any disease-free interval in ovarian cancer if you do some very ultra-sensitive technique you use to pick up. So you,
No, I think as a screening tool, I don't think it will work. But I do not agree with Amita that you shouldn't use it as a prognostication. Can I just answer that? I mean, for recurrence, in a recurrence setting, these will actually come into the blood only when you have when they actually go on forward from being stem cells or stem-like cells to being actual cancer cells. That is when they come into the blood, and they may identify low volume disease which you might want to do surgery on again.
currently, Rahul, we don't even treat patients who have CA-125 relapse, relapse based on. So you don't really want to pick up earlier than that. That's the whole idea. What do you treat with? No. Anyway, I think that will be.
Yeah.
Amita, I feel that in a recurrent setting, we don't know whether this test will be valid also.
Correct.
Yeah.
Because of the chemotherapy also, there will be some DNA damage, and probably the test may not be itself workable in a post-chemotherapy setting.
I think anything it has to be used in is for screening, like, for maybe in high-risk population. BRCA mutant. So currently we don't have any good screening method available.
Yeah, I think we have the last word from Dr. Preeta, and then we just close it.
Yes, it is debatable, but this technique might be what I feel that it would be very good for early detection of the cancer. If we don't look at the recurrent, but we want to catch the disease early, this kind of very sensitive technique, although it requires really validation, it's costly, everything, but some of the countries may use it as an early detection marker for this.
Okay, so I think as of now we cannot use.
It would be very costly. I mean, they have used the low level of, if you say each sample is few lakhs. Yeah, few lakhs.
Yeah, so I think as of now, I don't see this coming. Yeah. So I thank all the panelists for their valuable contribution, and thank the organizers for giving us the opportunity. Thank you. Thank you.